of Ed once again for our third webinar of the year, and our focus today for the South Dakota Principal Effectiveness Model is Domain 2, Instructional Leadership. And I just want to give a brief summary of this domain and what I really think describes it in a nutshell. Effective principals within this domain demonstrate the ability to review research and use data to promote a school culture and an instructional program that fosters student learning and professional growth for staff. And I think what will become evident as we move through the next 30 to 40 minutes is that within this model and within this domain, effective principals foster teacher leadership, and that some of the most powerful changes that we'll see in student learning is when teachers become learners of their own learning, and in turn they empower students to become leaders of their learning. And I think if you're familiar with the Danielson model, and I'm going to make some connections to this later, in the distinguished column in the Danielson model, in several of the rubrics, there is a focus on students leading their own learning and setting their own learning goals. So I just want to keep making those connections to the work you're doing with the Danielson model. We're going to move to slide 3. This is an overview of the Domain 2 for instructional leadership. The effective use of data to support instruction, involvement in curriculum, instruction, and assessment, distributed leadership. I just mentioned that, developing teacher leaders, monitoring and evaluating standards and content, and continuous improvement. And on page 23 of the Principal Effectiveness Handbook, you'll see that the domains are weighted. The 6 domains have a different weight, and you'll see that the recommended model suggests that instructional leadership be weighted at 30%, which is the most. It's the heaviest weight of any of the 6 domains. That said, districts have the option to change the domain weights, but I think the weight placed on instructional leadership really sends that message of what we believe the focus should be in our schools, and that's that heavy focus on instructional leadership, so that we can really impact how teachers teach and how students learn. And we'll move to the next slide, Matt. The first component in instructional leadership is the effective use of data to support instruction. The more time that I've spent with Domain 2 instructional leadership, and the more time I've spent with each of the rubrics, it has become really apparent to me that unless you really deal with domain or component 2.1, which is the effective use of data to support instruction, it really is hard to successfully address the other 4 components within this domain. I think you're going to find as we move through the components this afternoon that every single component addresses how we use data to make our decisions. So I really want to emphasize this 2.1, the using data, and not just standardized test scores, multiple kinds of data. Your data that you're drawing from your teacher evaluations, those classroom visits you make, your district level assessments, surveys. So when we talk about data, think in a real global way, not just about standardized test scores. So some questions, some considerations, some things, and we've moved to the next slide. Some things you might talk about when you begin to look at component 2.1. First of all, how do you collect and use data to develop your school improvement plan? And what kind of processes and procedures and protocols do you have in place to analyze that school-wide data? Do you have some really identified systemic process that you consistently use when you look at your data? How do you ensure time for teachers to analyze and work with the data to inform instruction? It's one thing to know what your data is. It's another thing to have that time for teachers to spend with the data to develop an understanding so that they can alter instruction to meet the needs of the students. Do you have a school leadership team? And if so, how do you engage them in establishing a data-driven school improvement plan? It can't be just about the principals presenting the data and making all the decisions about how the data is used. It has to be the team, a leadership team. And then another piece to this is, how do you engage the leadership team in making plans for the future? Are you only dealing with the right now, the here and now of your data, or are you looking at the data and thinking ahead of the implications, future implications of the data? And then finally, the last question on this slide is, what kind of professional growth do you provide for teachers, and how is it connected to the data? The school-wide data and the data about individual teachers. And you might ask the question, well, what do you mean data about individual teachers? The data about individual teachers could be surveys you give to teachers, but more importantly, it's that information that you, the principal, gather when you make those visits to classrooms to see instruction and determine the effectiveness of instruction. There's lots of data you can gather through your classroom walkthroughs, those formative visits that we're encouraging in this model. So now we're ready to move to that next slide. Just as with the last webinar, I've taken the rubric and I've tried to show you how a principal moves from basic to proficient to distinguished, and what are some of the real distinguishing factors between or among those three levels. So you can see that at the basic level, the principal identifies the data. I talked about that a minute ago when I asked those questions. You basically are just identifying the data. You are giving the teachers time to work with the data, and you are articulating a clear vision for the use of the data. But when you move into that proficient level, you see where I've underlined, now you're working with a leadership team. And now you're connecting your instructional improvement to your professional growth plan. So this principal is building a professional growth plan based on the data. And I talked about that systemic approach a while ago. This proficient principal has a very systematic approach and supports a data-driven culture and provides a very targeted professional development plan, not only based on student data, but on teacher data and other school-wide data. And then finally, that distinguished principal goes to that next level and identifies with the leadership team, identifies innovative instructional practices and student interventions based on data analysis, and encourages teachers to individually look at their data. Our teachers are engaged in SLO work. We're encouraging them to develop ongoing formative assessments in their classrooms. This distinguished principal really encourages teachers to look at their own data, not only individually, but at grade level, in grade level teams, content area teams, and then as they look at the data, revise their instructional approaches to meet the needs of the students. Okay, let's move to the next slide. We skipped the artifact slide. All right. Okay. All right. I won't spend time reading through this slide, and I didn't do this on the last webinar either, but what I've tried to do here is provide you with a progression of how the artifacts and the evidence might look at each of the levels with using data to support instruction, and how that basic, what does it look like at the very basic level, what kind of artifacts, what kind of evidence, and then moving forward to that distinguished level, how does the level of evidence and artifacts grow and change as you move from basic to proficient. And I think you'll see as you look at the artifacts, it's very closely tied to how the kind of professional development you provide, using data, and so forth. And like I said, I'm not going to read through this. This is for you to use on your own. And Matt, if we could move to the next slide now. The next component in Domain 2 is involvement in curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And whenever I see this, I think of that term we've all heard many, many times in the last few years, the term the guaranteed and viable curriculum. And that's what this component is all about. So effective principles within this component ensure ongoing development and monitoring, and I underline the word monitoring, ongoing development and monitoring of the guaranteed and viable curriculum. And you probably all know the definition, but I'm going to read a definition of a guaranteed and viable curriculum because you're going to hear references to this when we get into the next slides. A guaranteed and viable curriculum is one that guarantees equal opportunity for learning for all students. Similarly, it guarantees the time for teachers to reach content or to teach content and for students to learn it. And then finally, the guaranteed and viable curriculum is the one that guarantees that the curriculum that you're teaching is also the curriculum that's being assessed. And when we get into this a little bit farther, we'll talk about the intended curriculum, the taught curriculum, the different definitions of what a curriculum can be, and if they don't go together, if they're not in alignment, student learning won't take place. And if we can move to the next slide, some questions for you to consider. Do you and your leadership team develop a comprehensive school improvement plan? And how do you involve teachers in the development of rigorous and measurable goals for student achievement? And some examples, some things to think about that you're doing, your development of your SLOs, your grade level or your content area goals. Are those rigorous? Are they measurable? Are they lined up with your curriculum? How would you involve students? And this is something to think about. I was in a training working with some administrators not too long ago, and this question came up. How would you involve students in the development of rigorous and measurable goals for student achievement? And you might consider looking at the Danielson rubric. At the distinguished level, several of the rubrics suggest that students become involved in goal setting for their own learning. And how does that happen? How does the culture in a classroom become such that students become masters of their learning and develop an ability to set their own goals? And I'm not sure that's a question I have an answer for at this point, and I think it's something in the state that we have to talk about. How does that become part of our culture? Number 4, how do you align individual teacher and student learning goals with the broader school-wide improvement goals? For example, do all of your SLOs align with the school-wide goals for student achievement? Do they align with your curriculum goals? If you're a focus or a priority school, how do your goals for student learning align with the turnaround principles and the work you're doing as a focus priority school? What kind of professional growth have you developed or made available for your teachers? And I've just given some examples. Right now, we have the DOE is sponsoring an instructional reading coaching program, which I think about 15 of our schools are participating in. There's the MTSS training, RTI training that's going on, and these are just a few of those opportunities for professional growth that are out there. And then finally, how is your professional growth plan aligned with the school improvement plan and the goals for student learning? And again, I keep coming back to that curriculum. Are all those pieces aligned? The curriculum, the school improvement plan, SLOs, individual student learning goals, are they all lined up and moving in the same direction? Matt, if we could move to the next slide. And so here is that level comparison and progression for involvement in curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And I didn't have room on my slide to write all that out, so I'm using one of those acronyms, CIA, which is the Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment. At the basic level, the principal establishes rigorous, measurable goals, provides planning time and professional development, and develops a master schedule that allows time for teachers to plan and engage in professional development. But when you move to that proficient level, that principal is now monitoring that progress with both formative and common assessments. And that proficient principal monitors and evaluates the fidelity of implementation. So if you have a curriculum and you have goals and standards, are you, as a principal, are you monitoring and evaluating through collecting and analyzing data that everyone is implementing the curriculum that you've all agreed upon? And then this proficient principal also develops and executes a very specific professional development plan that's informed by the data. And I keep coming back to this. I know I sound like a broken record, but that is aligned with that curriculum, that guaranteed and viable curriculum that you've all agreed upon. And then that distinguished principal uses the leadership team to analyze those data sources. Not this principal isn't trying to do it all by himself or herself. Frankly, I don't think a principal can do it alone. I think a principal has to be working with the leadership team. And this distinguished principal also is demonstrating his or her own professional growth. How is the principal engaging in growing as a leader himself or herself? And then finally, that distinguished principal has some tools so that everyone can monitor and track student progress, whether it's data walls, data notebooks, or some kind of electronic or online Google Docs where everyone can go in and look at data as a group, not just individual data, but all of the data about the school. And we'll move to the next slide.
Apple cider.
Do you have a question? I heard a voice, so I wanted to make sure. I'm pausing for just a second here before I move to this next slide to answer any questions. I'm always mindful that we've promised to keep these anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, but I don't want to move so quickly that you can't ask questions. Okay, I'm going to keep rolling. So this next slide is that artifact progression for component 2.2, which is involvement in curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And you can see how the artifacts move from that very basic level to the distinguished level, and what you would need to be doing in terms of artifacts or evidence to move through the levels of progression. So can we go to the next slide? Yep. The next component 2.3, is distributive leadership, and I've referred to that several times already in our discussion today. I think I've probably referred to this with every webinar we've done so far, and every training that we've done from the DOE with regard to principal effectiveness, how important it is for teachers to become leaders of this process. So some questions for you to consider. What kind of leadership opportunities do you provide for staff? Or are you the principal that tries to do it all by yourself? It's a good question, good self-reflection question. Do you facilitate or make accessible to your staff mentoring programs that promote leadership? And here's an important one. When you delegate leadership tasks to staff, do you give them the authority to successfully complete the task? Because I'm not too sure delegating tasks will be effective unless the staff members have some authority to actually go through and carry through with the completion of the task. How do you monitor the progress and the completion of delegated tasks? And I'm going to stop right there because this is where your leadership team could come in and help you with that, so that as a leadership team, you're monitoring the tasks that are out there and how they're being accomplished. How do you recognize or celebrate staff members who seek out leadership responsibilities? How do you work with staff in a fashion that develops their ability to manage tasks and responsibilities? That's an interesting question. I think not just for teachers, I think that's an interesting question for us as administrators. How do we manage our time, and have we learned some skills so that we manage our time in a productive way, so that we, I used to say when I was a principal and an assistant superintendent, how can I manage my time so that I can keep all the balls in the air all the time? And if I have to drop a ball, it better be one that I can afford to drop for a little bit. How do I manage all those things that I have to do and all those responsibilities so that I keep those most critical ones in the air? And I know that was probably a really cliched reference, the old, using the balls in the air, but I keep thinking about my time as a principal, and I keep thinking about how do you keep all the balls in the air and do it correctly. And I think, how do we help our teachers? We're asking more and more of our teachers as well, and how do we teach them to manage their time and their responsibilities? How are you tying the leadership discussion with the Danielson model, particularly Domain 4, professional responsibilities? There are some really good tie-ins between this component and Domain 4 of the Danielson, which are the professional responsibilities. And then, have you considered involvement in the South Dakota Instructional Coaching Program as a way not only to strengthen instructional practice, but also to strengthen the leadership skills of both the principal and the teachers involved? So if you're at one of those schools out there and you're in the instructional coaching program, look at this component and look at your distributive leadership and ask yourself, How are my teachers who are involved in this, how are they learning some leadership skills, and how might I consider this as a way to enhance my leadership skills? I think there are some significant tie-ins there. And then with the distributive leadership, I've done the same thing. I've gone through and done the levels of comparison and progression. So that basic principle provides opportunities for some emerging leaders. That basic principle provides moderate support and encouragement for existing leadership positions, and occasionally seeks out staff for additional responsibilities, and does monitor the completion of the task, but not necessarily the progress towards the completion. But the proficient principle provides opportunities for all emerging leaders and creates leadership positions so that everyone has those opportunities, and is consistently seeking out staff to engage in leadership opportunities and monitors that progress. And then at the distinguished level, here's that word again, that systematically provides opportunities. Do you as a principal have some kind of systematic process in place where you have leadership positions and you monitor the progress of those positions? You perhaps create new positions. One of the things I thought about with this would be perhaps a committee or a team of teachers whose sole focus in your school is developing leadership opportunities that meet the needs of your schools, and then using that leadership team to help you monitor that process and what are the needs, because obviously I'm not asking you to create leadership tasks just to create leadership tasks. They should be tasks that meet the needs of your school and answer the questions that your data ask you. But I can't imagine a principal necessarily having time to do that all by yourself. I think that would be difficult with all the responsibilities that you have. But could a really sharp team of teachers help you with that process? Something to think about, and you probably have some better ideas out there as well. And if we can move to the next slide, here's the artifact progression. And then I went ahead and created this extra slide because as I looked at this particular component, I kept thinking back to my time as a principal and trying to think of, okay, with all the responsibilities I had as a principal, how would I do this? How would I do this? And I don't think I could do it by myself. And so I created a list here of some possibilities, just some things for you to think about for teachers to, opportunities for teachers to become leaders. Teachers are leaders when they're mentors, both at the local and the state level. They're leaders when they're literacy or math leaders or literacy or math coaches. They're leaders when they become members of committees, whether it's local, state, or national committees, curriculum committees, instructional councils, hiring committees. Department chairpersons are leaders, grade level leaders, provided you give them some authority. I don't know that a department chairperson can get a lot accomplished unless they have some authority to do what you've asked them to do. Your school and district level leadership teams, your PBIS teams, your data teams, your PLC teams, your BLT teams, internship opportunities. Do you look outside? For example, in the state of South Dakota, every year Maple puts on an Aspiring Leaders program that asks you as a principal to identify teachers in your school who might be who are emerging as leaders. The Porthon training, again, I keep coming back to that coaching for reading, the South Dakota instructional coaching model that we have in about 15 of our schools right now. Do you support your teachers who seek national certification? Because they certainly learn some leadership skills as they seek that national certification. 2.4 is the monitoring and evaluating standards and content. Some questions to ask. How do you monitor and ensure the alignment of the implemented curriculum with the intended curriculum? And I think you have to ask yourself and your teachers, do you know what that is? And you can look in the glossary in the Principal Effectiveness Handbook, but does your staff understand the difference between the implemented curriculum and the intended curriculum? How do you ensure adequate instructional time to cover the content and at the appropriate depth? Do you have pacing guides? That's question number 3. Have you worked with your staff to develop those? And then question 4, the Principal Effectiveness Rubric 2.4 uses the term experience curriculum. What does that mean? And how do you and your leadership team analyze the data from the experience curriculum? And how do you connect the experience curriculum to the implemented curriculum to the intended curriculum? And while you may understand that as principals, do your teachers understand that? How will you connect and use the teacher evaluation process to monitor and evaluate standards and content? And how do you work with teachers to ensure they're teaching at the appropriate depth? If you've had the Porthon training and you're currently enrolled in the training, how would you use some of the skills you're learning from the Porthon training to more effectively monitor standards and content? And how will you connect the monitoring and evaluating of standards to your work with the turnaround principles? Matt, can we move on?
Yep.
And so here's that levels of comparison and progression again. That basic principle ensures alignment. We keep seeing that word, ensures. Ensures that the teachers have the time and implements the systems that eliminate or minimize interruption. That proficient principle, we move from that word ensures to the word systematically monitors the implemented curriculum to ensure alignment. Monitors that teachers are on schedule to teach the intended curriculum at the appropriate depth. So are they keeping up with those pacing guides? And then the distinguished principal works with a leadership team, not just in isolation, but with a leadership team to monitor the connections between the experience curriculum and the implemented and the intended curriculum. And if we could move on. I know it's 4:35 and I'm trying to move along at a reasonable pace here. So here is the artifact progression for monitoring and evaluating standards and content, and I'll leave that with you to work with. And if we could move to the next slide. I couldn't resist a little humor here. I'm always nervous when I use humor, especially cartoons or jokes, because I certainly don't want to offend anybody. I hope I haven't offended anybody with this particular cartoon, but I couldn't resist this. I came across this one, and I really thought it probably speaks to that idea of continuous improvement. And I think it probably speaks for itself. And I'll apologize if I've offended anybody with the cartoon, but I just couldn't resist. So if we could go to the next slide. Continuous improvement. Most of the questions that I've already posed in the previous consideration slides address continuous improvement, so I really don't have many new questions at this point. I did want to reiterate, do you have a professional growth plan for your staff? How do you use the data to plan for professional development? And how do you access and provide training for research-based instructional strategies? And I would add to this, do you have a professional growth plan not only for your teachers, but do you have one for yourself as an administrator? And then here's that level comparison and progression. At that basic level, the principal analyzes the data, uses the results, draws on research, ensures that staff has access to research-based professional development opportunity. The proficient principal uses multiple sets of data and applies effective and continuous improvement strategies in the professional growth plan and encourages and supports staff participation in professional development. And then the distinguished principal has both short-term and long-term goals for professional growth and provides models of effective practice as part of the professional growth plan. And so let's look at the artifact progression, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to connect the artifacts in the distinguished level to that. If we went back to the previous slide where it says the principal provides models of effective practice. And so as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, okay, so what if somebody asked about what are models of effective practice? And I did want to look at that a little bit more. So if you look down at the distinguished level, some examples would be the current instructional coaching program, the instructional reading coaching program that I've mentioned several times today. A fully organized mentoring program would be a good example of a model. PBIS, the Aspiring Leaders program through MAPLE, the Porthon training, training in Socratic Seminar is a model of practice. Inquiry math training, reading recovery and other research-based literacy programs that are out there. College preparatory math, which is an inquiry-based math, high school inquiry-based math model. The training that we have in our state right now for the STEM and the CTE-based programs, I wanted to emphasize what those models might look like and the number of models we have available in the state. And I think I've probably scratched the surface here with some examples. Here is another way to look at the artifacts. I'm not going to read through these. I took this directly from the artifact list in the Principal Effectiveness Handbook. Here, like I did in the last webinar, I've aligned the Principal Effectiveness Domain 2 to the Teacher Effectiveness crosswalk so that you can see Component 2.1, the effective use of data to support instruction, aligns with multiple components from the Danielson model. 2.2, 2.3, I just pulled a snapshot of those from that crosswalk that's available on the DOE website so that you could see how many connections there are between Domain 2 instructional leadership and the teacher effectiveness domains, the Danielson model. I've provided a link because there are just too many. For the last webinar, there were a limited number of connections between the turnaround principles and the principal effectiveness model. I was able to compact them all into a couple of slides. There are just too many connections for me to do that on a 2 or 3 slides, and you wouldn't be able to read it anyway. So what I've referenced here is the principal and turnaround principles comparison that I sent to all of you. If you're signed up for the class, I sent you the PowerPoint and I sent you this document. It's called Principal and Turnaround Principle Comparison, and you can spend some time and scroll down and see how the two are connected. And I will also say at this point that Matt has done some updating on that comparison to make it clearer for the focus and priority schools, and he'll be sending that out. You're going to get a better version, I think a clearer version of that comparison. And then, as always, I conclude with that link to the South Dakota Department of Education, the Teacher Principal Effectiveness link, where multiple resources are available. And it's 4:45. Do you have any questions? Were there any questions out there? Should we unmute to see? Do you have any questions out there?
Terry Gerber here in Canton.
Yes.
There's been a lot of emails flying across my desk this week concerning the feds reauthorizing the ESEA. You know, my understanding is that once the president signs it into law, it'll go into effect in 2017. You know, that means we'll have about 1 year carryover with our current federal waiver. You know, has there been any talk at the state level about where we're going to go from there? Is there any talk about rebuilding our system at the state level, or and you know, with the principal effectiveness, are we going to stick with our current timelines, or is it possible that the state will delay implementation?
Carla Leingang is sitting right here with us, and we're going to let her answer that question, or ask her to answer that question. Thank you.
Yes. We've been anticipating that question. So with the ESSA reauthorization that was signed today by the president, evaluation is no longer a requirement, and the waivers end as of August of this year.
Oh, wow.
However, principal and teacher effectiveness are both in state statute and rule. So principal and teacher effectiveness are not going away. It's going to continue. The requirements that U.S. Fed was trying to require us to do with the waiver was to directly tie student growth to the teacher evaluations, and we refused to do that, and we will continue not to do that as a part of teacher and principal evaluation. But it's not going to change any of the implementation timelines or anything like that. We'll go back and look at our rules and look at some of the things, but the bottom line is it's not going to make any changes because of it is in statute and rules.
Okay. But probably correlating then student results with the teacher evaluation, then teacher evaluation tied to the principal evaluation. Is that going to stay in place?
Yes, everything is as we have presented it will stay in place.
Okay.
Good question, and one we've heard throughout this week. Other questions?
The one area I can say we will take a look at is the requirement that teachers in tested, graded, and subjects who are also teaching other subject areas, you know, there was the requirement that they had to do their SLO on that tested, graded, or subject. We will review that. That was really more of a requirement of the waiver, and I know that it's caused frustration, and we definitely want to look at that. So if anyone has any comments or thoughts, we appreciate hearing those.
And in terms of the student growth goal for the principals, I'd like to emphasize at this point, when we did the second webinar on creating those principal growth goals, remember we talked a lot about the growth goal should be related to the SBAC results, but it doesn't have to be assessed with the SBAC results. It could be assessed with local assessments, district level assessments, formative assessments that you develop at your level. All we've asked is that you consider the SBAC results when you write that principal student growth goal. So even as it stands right now, the principal student growth goal is not tied directly to the results of the standardized tests that are administered. They are part of the principal's growth goal is tied to the SLOs that teachers write, but those are also based on formative assessments that are administered in the classroom or assessments that are developed at the district level.
Thank you.
Does that help some?
Yeah, it does clear some things up.
These are good questions, so please, we wanted people to ask questions, so we welcome them. Please, if you have more questions, please speak up. No more questions? Then Matt is going to talk a little bit about a survey we're going to put out there to give us a little feedback so that we hopefully can make these webinars better for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, so the intent of this is just to get feedback on this webinar. Don't worry, it's just, I think, 4 questions, multiple choice. 5, sorry. And yeah, just very short, just want to gather feedback, just trying to see how this is going, how we can prepare for the next webinar. So we would just appreciate you taking just a couple minutes just to fill that out. And yeah. Oh, and I guess you have to copy and paste this. It won't let you just click it. So just copy it and then paste it into your web browser.
We can't make it any better if we don't know what we need to do differently. So we'd appreciate your really honest feedback on that survey. Thank you. Everybody have a good afternoon and have a restful and family-filled holiday season. If you're traveling, travel safely. And we will conclude with that unless you have some questions still. Good evening, everyone.